China has identified the cause of the mysterious pneumonia outbreak in Wuhan city, and it's from the same family that caused the deadly SARS epidemic 17 years ago.
More than 15,000 scientists are sounding an alarm about climate change. They call it a warning to humanity.
The President of the United States essentially alleging that there is a conspiracy to steal and rig the election so that he loses. Again, there's no evidence to back up that claim.
This court has already concluded that the Prime Minister's advice to Her Majesty was unlawful, void, and of no effect. This means that the order in council to which it led was also unlawful, void, and of no effect, and should be quashed.
What's going on?
Let me tell you something.
That's the problem that we got.
That you see right now, it's gonna happen 10 years from now. And at 26, you're gonna be doing the same thing I'm doing. You understand that? 10 years. You're gonna be right here too.
But he also got to
So what I need y'all to do right now at 16 is come up with a better way. Because how we doing it, it ain't working.
Well, good evening, everyone, from London and Cambridge. I'm Douglas Blawston, and I'm Chairman of the Whitehall Lectures. On behalf of Com Lauder, Chairman of the Whitehall Group Forum, and Ian Marcus, President of the Cambridge University Land Society, I would like to warmly welcome you all to the 9th Whitehall Lecture. The Cambridge University Land Society is the alumni society of the Department of Land Economy in the University of Cambridge, and is the largest departmental alumni society in the university. Land economy itself was established nearly 60 years ago, and it sits within the School of Humanities, and its ethos is a holistic approach to land use, encompassing economic, legal, planning, societal, and environmental issues, studied within undergraduate and graduate courses in an intensive research-orientated environment. The Whitehall Lectures were inaugurated by Professor Sir Malcolm Grant at the Royal Institution of Great Britain in 2014, and they seek to explore some of the important issues of society today that affect and influence government policies, not just in the united for the moment, kingdom, but globally. I'm very grateful to our sponsors for supporting this lecture and the panel discussion following. David Runciman's published and recorded works on the future of democracy and the power of politicians could not be more relevant for us than it is today, and so the timing of this lecture is totally apposite. For a brief period in time this year, 3 months to be exact, the air pollution in London and in cities around the world dropped to previously unimaginable levels. And in my case, in suburban London, some 20 minutes away from Mayfair in the West End, a seemingly remarkable variety of wildlife returned to our gardens. The immediate cost of the dramatic changes brought about was economic and healthcare stress and an assault on mental health, particularly for those least able to cope with the imposed isolation and economic hardship. As a society, and a world unprepared for change. The effort and investment made since then has been to conquer the pandemic, save lives, and for us to return to normal. That normality is to pollute and invest in economies that will guarantee we pollute more and more into the future. As Greta Thunberg says, our response to the pandemic does show that we can treat a crisis like a crisis, but it also really proves that the climate crisis has never once been treated as a crisis. It is just being treated as a public and important question, like a political topic. In the last 6 years in Western democratic politics, it has for many been seen around the world as a disparate but concerted attack on the generally accepted normal rules of our democratic systems, which are an acceptance of well-established laws, court rulings, accepted legal or non-legal precedent. The former French resistance fighter, foreign minister and prime minister, Georges Bidault, wrote that the good or bad fortune of a nation depends on 3 factors: its constitution, the way the constitution is made to work, and the respect it inspires. Many people see the attacks on our established norms by elected leaders as having resulted in a significant democratic deficit of such magnitude that the protection for societies by these rules has fallen away and has lost much credibility. For those of us who have seen the short video clip just now, we have witnessed the elected presidents of the free world's most powerful democracy seek to undermine its fundamental structure of voters' rights, and a British Prime Minister seeking to override the People's Elected Assembly by acting unlawfully. Although the authority of the elected assembly has been protected by the judges of our Supreme Court, we now see the executive possibly seeking to curtail those protections. There are a variety of views as to the causes for these volcanic events, which seem to threaten the foundations of our democratic systems. For many people around the world, the crisis affecting the world's leading liberal democracies started in earnest some 6 years ago with a dismantling of established structures, legal and non-legal. It will be a long road to re-establish the high ground again for the so-called exemplars of liberal democracy. But in the meantime, as Thunberg says, until world leadership treats climate crisis like a crisis, only then can we change and achieve things. The large international attendance this evening for this lecture, 13 countries, 15 universities, and a number of very brave journalists who've risked and indeed been in prison for defending the democratic imperative, attests to the importance of Professor Runciman's lecture and the undoubted profundity of his writings on democracy and power. Has COVID killed the climate? And has the democratic system of government failed us all? Like all of you, I look forward to hearing his views and to the discussion following by our eminent panel, moderated by Bronwyn Maddox. David.
Douglas, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a sadness not to be able to deliver this lecture in person, but we're all learning to adapt. And indeed, that is the theme that I want to talk about. And in a way, I want to address the very pertinent questions that you raised there in your introduction, and particularly, I suppose, the Greta Thunberg question, which is what have we learned this year about the ability of democratic societies, particularly, to address a crisis as though it were a crisis, to adapt, to innovate, to reform, and for people as well, not just politicians, to change. So I'm talking about the link between COVID and climate. I'm not trying to make a grand argument in relation to the science. I'm not trying to make a big anthropological argument in relation to what the pandemic tells us about our treatment of the natural world. I'm interested in the basic question about democratic politics and its adaptability, which is how well suited are the systems that we live in, and I'm assuming here we're talking primarily about the world's leading democracies, to meeting these kinds of challenges, and can we draw parallels between them? And I think the reason this is an acute question now, and it's not just Greta Thunberg, many people I think this year have wondered whether 2020 has given us a sign, a set of indications about our ability to change. And if we have learned about our ability to change, what does that mean for how we might tackle climate change in the future? And part of the interest of this for me, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, is that I've read things and I've encountered people, I've had conversations in which fairly diametrically opposed lessons have been drawn from this year. So there is, I think, an optimistic story, and I think there is a pessimistic story. And I'm going to take the optimistic argument first. I'm going to try and identify what I think are some of the positive themes that we can take from 2020. And I am going to assume, I'm not going to argue this, that climate change is a very, very serious crisis. And it is one that will, at some point, require both adaptation and innovation, including at the social and political level and the economic level, of course. So there is an optimistic story about the relationship between COVID and climate, and there's also a pessimistic story. And I want to do optimism first, not because I then want to debunk it with pessimism, but because I think it is important to lay these two out separately and then to compare them. So what is the optimistic story that we've learned this year? Well, one is, to put it quite simply, democratic states, including those like the United Kingdom that are governed by centre-right parties, have shown that there is a magic money tree when there needs to be. That is, in the face of a really serious systemic crisis, an emergency, money can be found, and money can be found, among other things, to compensate people for enforced change, individuals, communities, businesses, for fundamental changes in the way they operate and the way they live. The kind of disruption that we so fear can be softened by government's willingness to act, to subsidize, to support, to borrow, to find the money that's needed. And in the face of this kind of action, I think it has become harder to make the case that has sometimes been made, including by centre-right politicians, that we can't afford the kinds of actions that are required, or at least demanded, by activists in relation to climate change. That argument is harder to make after a year in which we have shown that we can afford it. Now, of course, the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the House of Commons yesterday, a Conservative Chancellor, said there is no, not in these terms, there is no magic money tree, that what is borrowed has to be repaid. And of course, the pessimistic take is the immediate riposte to what I've just said. On the one hand, it's harder to say that we can't afford it because we've just shown that we can afford things we thought we couldn't afford. And on the other hand, we've just spent the money on this. COVID has used up the magic money tree, and the kinds of long-term plans that were laid out yesterday do not leave a lot of room for extra spending. And if extra spending, if extra government investment is needed, maybe we are more, not less constrained. We shall see. I'll come back to that. I think the second possible grounds here for optimism relates not just to the adaptability of politicians, but the adaptability of all of us. I speak for myself, and other people will take a different view. But as we come to the end of this year, it is striking the extent to which really radical behavioral change has been both adopted and accepted, in the sense that things we really didn't think we would be willing to put up with, we have put up with. Changes in how we work, fundamental changes in how we travel and how we commute. Most of us have given up air travel. The kinds of changes that have actually led to what Douglas described, the most optimistic in a way take on COVID were those moments, particularly in the late spring, early summer, where people went outside for the first time and found that the air was cleaner, the grass looked like it was greener, and nature seemed to be flourishing. We have changed in ways that climate change maybe also demands, and we've done it not simply because we've been coerced to do it, because there's also quite a lot of evidence that much of the change was voluntary, that individuals and indeed organizations adapted before governments told them to adapt. It may also be that some of the resistance to coercion has also come sooner than governments would like. But if you remember in the spring when there was talk of herd immunity and of different ways that this might play out, some behavioral scientists warned that About 2 weeks was the limit of individuals like us, that is, citizens of liberal democratic societies, our tolerance for being told to remain in our homes, that lockdown probably had a 2 to 3 week shelf life. Well, here we are 8 months in, lockdown again. And there is more resistance, no question. There's also quite a lot more political pushback. But I think the overall story is one of surprising levels of compliance, not surprising levels of resistance. So politicians have shown that they can change, and we've shown that we can change. And then the other optimistic story, the much more recent one, is the innovation story. Again, I'm sure this is not my field. I'm not by any means an expert in the science here. I'm the opposite of that. But I've spoken to people over the past year, just as a concerned citizen, as I'm sure many of you have in the different countries that you are, asking people who one hope might know about the prospects for a vaccine, whether one was coming. And there was a lot of skepticism and a lot of doubt that some of the talk of this being done this year was not just premature, it was actually wishful. And yet it turns out that a combination of government investment in the United States, at least 12 billion of federal spending to support vaccine research, strong, very strong market incentives, including the enormous rewards for the people who got there first, and because there is, among other things, absolutely certain government demand for a successful product. So a combination of private and public, state and market, and throwing out conventional cost-benefit analysis and being willing to throw money and people and human hours at the problem has, it seems to this point anyway, shown that we can do things much quicker than we thought, and successfully. I mean, we have to wait and see. But certainly in the last month, the last few weeks, the news is good on the capacity, and this is of primarily the world's leading liberal democratic societies, to innovate their way out of a crisis. And if that's true of this, why should it not also be true of climate change? And then two more briefly. I think that this year has also potentially at least removed two barriers that stand in the way of concerted climate action. One very directly political, that I'll come on to and relates to the film that we saw at the beginning. The other, I think, deeper and more structural. So the structural challenges often seem to me in democratic societies to concerted action on climate change is the increasing generational divide in our politics. There are many divides in our politics. Education is another. But the generation divide is stark. The preferences, the beliefs, and the behavior, including the voting behavior of older citizens, has radically diverged from younger citizens. And climate change is one of the markers of that, because in polling evidence, it is quite clear that climate change is a much, much more pressing issue when people are asked what is the thing that you are most worried about for the under 35s relative to the over 65s. And yet, democratic politics in the West for quite a while now has been skewed towards the preferences and indeed the voting behavior of older voters. There are more people over 65 than under 35 in many Western electorates. They vote in greater numbers and their preferences tend to win out. And democratic politics has been skewed against the interests of younger voters for a while. And climate is in one sense a victim of that. But this year has potentially at least changed the dynamics of generational politics, because the young have also suffered this year. One of the consequences of COVID shutdowns, economic and more straightforwardly social and cultural, is that a burden has been borne by younger voters. And this has been for the sake of the old. It's a accident of this pandemic. It doesn't mean anything beyond its long-term consequences, that it does discriminate against the old. The most vulnerable by far to illness and death are those not just aged over 65, but aged over 75. A cost has been borne by the young for the sake of the old. And if there is a recognition of that in democratic politics in a post-COVID environment, when we come out of this, if, I think it's a big if, but if it at least raises the possibility of rectifying the generational imbalance, there is something that must be paid back to the young after this year. Now, it could be financial support, it could be all sorts of things. But one thing it might be is action on climate change. And then the final barrier that has been removed is the obvious one. Probably the biggest obstacle to concerted international action on climate change over the last 4 years has been the brute fact that the duly elected president of the United States, Donald Trump, was not the person to take that action. Indeed, he did much to make it much harder. And in less than 2 months' time, and I promise you this is true, he will not be president of the United States. Now, I'm aware that for many people, the election a few weeks ago was shocking, not because Trump lost, but because he nearly won. And it was so close that the expectation that the failure of his administration, and it is a failure, and it's not just a relative failure, I think it's an absolute failure, to handle the COVID pandemic would cost him at the ballot box. And the closeness of the result and the fact that some exit polling indicated that the coronavirus was not a priority for many voters suggested to many people that this was not a COVID election, that it was so close and Trump got so much support that COVID clearly was not the decisive factor. I actually disagree with that. I take a different view. I believe that before February, Donald Trump was heading for re-election. The American economy was sufficiently strong, and the polling evidence was that, particularly in the swing states that he needed to win, the voters agreed with him, many of them, not all of them, of course, but many of them, that they were better off than 4 years ago, which is one of the strongest indicators of likely electoral outcomes. Other things being equal, Donald Trump was extremely well placed in early 2020 to win a second term. And the fact that he hasn't, I think almost certainly is a consequence of what happened in between. And what happened in between was the pandemic. And in some of those swing states, there is evidence that the voters who swung against Trump because of a rapid deterioration in their expectations of not just their economic, but their life prospects. So it could be said that COVID gave us President Biden. And President Biden has said that in his first 100 days, action on climate change will be a priority. So if COVID gave us Biden and Biden gives us action on climate change, then maybe COVID, far from killing the climate, saved the climate. Maybe. I think there is something to be said for all of those arguments, but I also think there's something to be said against them. So let me just go through let's call it the skeptical rather than the pessimistic take. And I'll as I would do it in reverse order. I'll start where I just finished. So yes, Donald Trump will soon no longer be president of the United States, but I think it is a big mistake, and I think it's a perpetual hazard of democratic politics, that we overinterpret the significance of election results, that much of what matters happens at a deeper or more structural or institutional level. And there are some facts about American democracy that have not changed, notwithstanding Trump's defeat. So we don't yet know whether Biden will or won't have, and if he does, it will be an absolutely bare majority in the Senate. There are 2 elections still to come in Georgia in January, which will go a long way to deciding what legislation is possible. It is also true that the consequences of 4 years of Donald Trump will linger much longer, and this goes way beyond, I think, the breaching of democratic norms. I think Joe Biden can do quite a lot to repair democratic norms. I don't think he's going to be able to do anything about the United States Supreme Court. And Donald Trump, by chance, by accident, not by design, got to nominate 3 justices. And there is a lot of discussion about how the court might change American politics, and there's a focus particularly on questions like abortion and whether Roe versus Wade might be overturned. That's not for now. I think what is clear is that the Supreme Court is now heavily skewed, thanks to Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, in an anti-regulatory direction, that the one thing that the new justices have in common is opposition to the regulatory administrative state. And that may particularly relate to federal action on climate change. It's possible that the legacy of the Trump years is far greater constraint on executive discretion in this area, never mind the possibility of legislation that doesn't get struck down. And I think the other fact about American politics that is unchanged by this election is that climate change remains part of that zero-sum tit-for-tat partisanship, which goes back well before Trump, goes back at least to the Obama years, and makes climate and concerted action on climate very difficult, because I think both sides still see climate change primarily in terms of what it means for the other side. If they're for action, we're against it. If they're against action, we're for it. But what an executive does, an executive can undo. And if legislation is going to be hard, executive action is intensely vulnerable to this kind of tit-for-tat politics. And nothing about the election, nothing, to my mind, suggests that that has changed. I also think that the other way we overinterpret election results is we take too short-term a view. So it is true, I think it is true that COVID probably gave us President Biden. It spared us from another term of President Trump. But I think the idea that that signals the long-term direction of the consequences of COVID for democratic politics is very wishful, because it is just far too soon to say what impact 2020 will have in the medium, never mind the long term, on democratic outcomes. And we have an example of this. And the example that we have of the difference between the immediate and the medium-term impact of a crisis, a really large systemic crisis, is the consequences of the 2008 financial crisis. So in the short term, the 2008 financial crisis gave us President Obama. I've just finished reading Obama's memoirs of the first few years of his presidency, and in them he says the moment he knew he was going to be president was just after Lehman Brothers collapsed, when his rival John McCain summoned a group of politicians to the White House for an emergency meeting. And when he was asked for his plan, he had no plan. And at that point, Obama knew he was going to win. Lehman Brothers collapsed and Obama became president of the United States. He might have done anyway, but that sealed the deal. But that was not the medium-term consequence of the financial crisis. The idea that the financial crisis was going to lead to a widespread adoption of Obama-style, pragmatic, mildly progressive, competent politics was an illusion. The medium-term consequences of the financial crisis were Brexit and Trump and Corbyn and Syriza in Greece, left populism, right populism, anger, frustration, resentment at the democratic system, rage in many places, very surprising electoral outcomes. In the short term, the electoral consequence of the financial crisis, the election of Barack Obama, was not that surprising, certainly once he'd won the nomination. But recently, democratic politics has been consistently surprising. Polls have got it wrong time after time. They got that election bang on. They haven't been getting them right since. This is all a medium-term legacy of the disruption of the financial crisis. When it shook out the winners, the losers, the people who'd got away with it, the people who thought that they were unjustly treated. We cannot judge how COVID will play out in similar terms. Once we are past the emergency and we're into the shakedown, the shakeout of this in economic terms, in social terms, when the winners and the losers become clearer, when the price has to be paid, democratic politics is, I think, almost certainly going to surprise us again. And I don't think it's by any means certain it's going to surprise us necessarily in a Joe Biden direction. Pragmatic, mildly progressive, one hopes, competent politics. In a UK context, I would just say two words in this respect. Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage has not disappeared from British politics, and Nigel Farage has turned the Brexit Party into the Reform Party. And something that's worth remembering about Nigel Farage is that he is a lifelong Eurosceptic, but he's also, broadly speaking, a climate skeptic. The Reform Party is an anti-lockdown party, but it also seems to be an anti-cycle lane party. I think it's a pro-motorists party. When I heard Nigel Farage speak in Cambridge, it must be at least a decade ago, where he made his pitch, the three things that he believed in political terms. One was that the UK was about to be swamped by immigration from the new states into the European Union, The second was that democratic politics was a kind of cabal of Oxbridge-educated boys who'd never done a day's work in their life. And the third was that wind farms were a scam against the taxpayer. Well, on the first, the consequences of his first set of beliefs we know, but I think the second and the third probably still hold for him. And there is still plenty of mileage in those beliefs. We'll have to see. The Conservative government has just announced that it wants to advance its program for achieving carbon neutrality, not least by getting diesel and petrol cars off the road sooner than might otherwise have been expected. We are 4 years out from an election. That kind of talk is cheap now. I think in 4 years' time, politics might look quite different. I also think that the brute demographic facts have not changed. So yes, I think there absolutely is a case for a generational rebalancing, and COVID has really highlighted the imbalance, the different prices that are paid by different generations for the kind of political and economic system that we have. But the demography is unchanged. We still live in democratic societies that aren't just aging, but in which older voters tend to decide the outcome of elections. And it is not the case that Joe Biden won because of a groundswell of youth support. Joe Biden won partly because some older voters turned against Donald Trump, but they did not turn against Donald Trump because Joe Biden was the champion of action on climate change. I think there's nothing in the recent US election that suggests a shift towards the kind of radical agenda that's favored not just by younger voters, but also by some younger politicians, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Green New Deal agenda. There's nothing in that election, I think, that suggests that the American public have endorsed it. The Republicans won seats in the House of Representatives. It wasn't just that Trump did surprisingly well. The Republican Party did surprisingly well, and older voters still decide elections. There is a long way to go, and there may need to be change to electoral systems to shift that balance. So a lot hangs not on electoral outcomes, but on a sense of justice. And I think a sense of justice in the absence of a shift in electoral politics is not something to rely on. And then let me just say something, and I'm not going to go on at great length here. Let me just say something about what you might call the broader case for optimism, the case in favor of adaptability, flexibility on the part of politicians, flexibility, behavioral change on the part of the public, our willingness to sacrifice, to give things up this year, things that we thought we wouldn't give up. We have given up, and some of us are quite happy to have given them up. And there are some things that we have given up that we may never resume doing. We don't know yet. We don't know how fixed this behavioral change is. But some patterns of certainly work might have changed. The way I work might have changed. I don't know if I'm ever going to go back to lecturing to students in poorly lit, poorly ventilated halls. We'll have to see. But it is also the case that this change has been relatively short term. And there is a difference, I think, between a crisis like the pandemic and the pressure that it's put on governments all around the world. An immediate crisis, a short-term crisis, a crisis in which the costs of inaction can be measured in days and weeks, not months and years and decades. And a challenge, a crisis, a systemic threat like climate change, which is literally a slow burn crisis. And to draw lessons from one for the other, I think is possibly a category mistake. So it seems to me that the response to the pandemic has more in common with how democratic states and democratic governments respond to war or respond in times of war. And this was cited yesterday in the Commons. The British state has borrowed more money to deal with this crisis than at any time in its history except in wartime. This is the highest level of peacetime borrowing. This is peace being treated as though we were in a kind of war. And that is not, I think, analogous to climate change. So a lot of the innovation that we've seen, I think, models the pattern of the kind of innovation that comes out of wartime spending and wartime emergency action. One of the features of the response to the pandemic is that a lot of the spending has been extremely wasteful. Money has literally, or if you can literally do this these days, literally been thrown at the problem. And as I said, cost-benefit analysis to some extent has gone out of the window because things have to happen quickly. And there is a lot of historical evidence that that kind of behavior on the part of governments and states is the engine of innovation, that many of the transformative technologies of the world that we live in now, the internet, fracking, the renewables energy revolution, are a product initially of the heavy lifting and vastly wasteful spending of states under conditions of what they think of as wartime stress. The First World War, the Second World War, and the Cold War, particularly in the American military industrial establishment, were the engines of innovation. And this year, to some extent, has modeled that. And it raises the question, therefore, of whether climate and the climate change emergency could be treated as though it were a war. Extinction Rebellion on Armistice Day staged a protest at the Cenotaph, where a former soldier unfurled a banner which read, "Honor their sacrifice, climate change means war." And I think there is a sense that were we to treat the climate emergency with the kind of urgency that we do treat, that states, including democratic states, do treat military threats, particularly when those threats are, to use a word I don't particularly like, existential. We do have the capacity. We have the money, we have the political will, we have the willingness of democratic electorates and citizens to change their behavior. We know that. Democracies have been through worse, and they have both adapted and innovated and spent their way out. But this isn't a war, and nor even is the COVID pandemic a war. So it mimics, to some extent, warlike behavior, but it's not a war. And the kinds of change that we've seen in 2020, I think, are more likely to be transient than permanent for that very reason. This is, relatively speaking, certainly compared to the kind of transformation that comes out of systemic warlike challenges, it's likely to be more superficial. So let me just try and illustrate this in a couple of ways, and then I'll wrap up. So as I mentioned, the United States federal government has invested heavily, 12 billion plus, in supporting vaccine research and innovation. And on the podcast I host called Talking Politics, we were having a conversation a couple of weeks ago about this question with the economic historian Adam Tooze. And I was asking this very question: does 2020 suggest the adaptability of Western societies for climate, given the relative success in some respects of the adaptation and the innovation in relation to COVID? And he said, if you think about it, $12 billion is nothing. It's a rounding error in one federal government's departmental accounts. And yet, innovation has been achieved. So imagine what could be done by a state, that is a national state, a president, an administration, with the political will to spend on the scale, you might call it the warlike scale, that climate requires, just what we could achieve. But the skeptical view is, but we can't do that in the absence of the kind of existential threat that generates this kind of spending. If 12 billion is peanuts, because COVID was a serious threat, how bad does climate have to get? How warlike does it have to get before we start spending on that scale? And no one who isn't mad can wish for a war to generate the kind of government action that produces the results we need. We have to do it in the absence of war. And then the other thing to say is that the case is often made again by the positivists, the optimists, that history shows us that governments with a political will can do this outside of wartime, because the original New Deal was not a response to war. Roosevelt's New Deal was a response to the Great Depression. And with that kind of political will, and some people have drawn a comparison between Joe Biden and Franklin Roosevelt, and the possibility, at least, that this is another Democratic president who might just have the opportunity to effect structural systemic change with a Green New Deal. If Roosevelt could do it, Biden can do it. But Roosevelt didn't do it. The original New Deal actually ran out of steam by 1937-38. The structural features of American democracy defeated it. The checks, the balances, the opposition of the Republican Party, the opposition at the state level, the complexity of American political life. Roosevelt achieved a lot in his first 100 days, and Biden may achieve a lot in his first 100 days, but in 100 days, you do not affect structural or systemic change. You do executive things. You rescue people, you save people. And Biden, in his first 100 days, though he said climate will be a priority, will be focused on the pandemic because it will still be raging in the United States post-Thanksgiving, post-Christmas. A lot can be done in 100 days, but the thing that turned the New Deal from something that American politics could defeat to something that no administration could overturn was the Second World War. The Second World War turbocharged the New Deal. There is a more pessimistic lesson for advocates of the Green New Deal from Roosevelt's experience, which is that he was defeated by American politics, and it was war that changed American society. So to finish, 2 concluding remarks, and I really will stop in 5 minutes. We have seen adaptation and innovation this year. We've seen it in Britain, we've seen it in America. We've adapted, our politicians have adapted, science has adapted and innovated. There have been remarkable success stories. The one thing that has not adapted or innovated is the structure of democratic politics. The structure of democratic politics seems to me to be unchanged by the experience of this year. Yes, in the United States, there were many, many more mail-in ballots than traditional because of COVID. That is not structural systemic change. And in the age of the internet, the fact that these were mailed in, I don't think is a model for the future. This has been the year of executive action, of prime ministers, presidents, governors giving news conferences, of following the science until the science becomes politically inconvenient. This has been the year of high politics, of shenanigans in the White House in Downing Street. This has been the year of Dominic Cummings and Carrie Simons. Many people have commented that in some respects, democratic politics this year has become almost medieval. The question is, does the prime minister's girlfriend like you or not? That is not democratic innovation. And I have remained fairly convinced for some time now that with all our talk of adaptation and innovation in relation to climate change, without democratic adaptation and innovation, changing the way we do it, being more deliberative, more participatory, more open, more street politics, more civil disobedience, more Extinction Rebellion. I mean, I know many people can't stand Extinction Rebellion, but without, it's still democracy. Street politics is still democracy. Civil disobedience is still democracy. Without more innovation and adaptation at the level of not what politics we do, what we want to happen, but how we do it, climate still looks to me like a fairly intractable problem for Western democracies. And 2020 has not seen political adaptation. If anything, it has entrenched the sclerotic systems that we have. And then finally, there is that other question about 2020, which is, for many people, Donald Trump was the threat to democracy. And now that that threat has been removed, I've read an article in the New York Times, I think every day, saying, phew, democracy is back. Well, maybe it's back. I never thought Donald Trump was the threat anyway. But 2020 may mark a watershed year in a completely different way, because the pandemic has also shown us, though in some respects we've done remarkable things, the flagship democracies, the United States, Western Europe, have not done well. We've muddled through, but relative to how the Chinese state dealt with the pandemic, leaving aside all questions of where it came from, this year could mark a watershed year in the history of democracy because of what will be perceived to be a relative failure relative to the kind of autocratic state that is able to take more decisive action. Of course, some other democracies have done well, New Zealand, South Korea, but the flagship democracies and the flagship democracy, the United States of America, has not done well. I have no idea in the medium term what lessons will be drawn about the relative strengths and weaknesses of Western liberal democracy versus Chinese autocratic state capitalism. But it is at least possible that the lesson of this year will be that COVID showed certain kinds of actions are beyond liberal democracies and are not beyond other kinds of political systems. And that lesson conceivably could apply to climate change. It could. I'm absolutely not saying that it necessarily does. And I think that there are huge medium-term challenges for the Chinese political system as well. But it is at least a possibility. And if that is a possibility, we have to be open to the thought that the consolation that we're taking from this year by the muddled innovation, and then when I say muddled innovation, I mean it's not been systemic. It seems just about that we're going to get away with it. That looks relatively inadequate for the kinds of threats that the 21st century is going to pose. So I don't think that COVID killed action on climate change in the sense that COVID has colonized our attention. We've spent all the money, we've got no money left. It's going to be another few years before we can even get back to this issue. It's all going to be about return to growth, recovery, and so on. I don't think there was any choice. I mean, I certainly am not one of those people who thinks that any elected politician in a year like this year could say climate change is a more significant priority than the pandemic. The pandemic was and remains the #1 priority for any elected politician who wishes to survive another day in office. That's not the issue. The issue for me is that it's too easy and possibly too tempting to draw false analogies from the success stories. There have been success stories of democratic responses to COVID, the adaptability, the innovation, the surprising things that we have been willing to do, and to make the wrong comparison. I think it's more likely that COVID will do long-term damage to the prospects of action on climate change if we think that COVID is the model, because there are lots of political and historical reasons for thinking that it is not the model for action on climate change. Thank you very much.
Well, that was quite something. And I hope those images of chaos were images of chaos in parliamentary buildings and not amongst our audience watching the lecture tonight and David's comments. But thank you for a very stimulating and highly controversial lecture, David. Now, Bronwyn Maddox is going to lead our distinguished panel in the discussion. And you've seen on the screen the opportunity for you all to send in your questions, and they will be, we'll try and filter as many as we can during the discussion. Bronwyn was a hugely successful foreign editor of the Times. She built up the political magazine Prospect, into a major force in political discussion. And then she's gone on to lead the Institute for Government set up by Lord Sainsbury, and is now, within a very short period of time, as you would expect, one of our leading think tanks and a highly responsible one. So Bronwyn, the floor's yours. Good luck.
Douglas, thank you very much indeed. And David, thank you for giving us a terrific lecture, not just taking this crisis, and goodness knows an awful lot has been said about this crisis already, but using it to discuss what we might do about the next one. I mean, where I thought was very imaginative when I saw it and listening to it. I was struck by the symmetry of you laid out the optimism. I was feeling quite cheerful at that point, and then the blows of the pessimism or the skepticism, as you said, came in, and you left us at the end on really quite a skeptical, sobering note, which we're going to discuss. So I've got a terrific panel here with me to discuss all that. We have tonight Edward Luce, Financial Times US editor, Dr. Marina Povatkina of the Department of Political Science, University of Oslo and Gothenburg, Dr. Ellen Quigley, advisor to the Chief Financial Officer and also Research Associate in Climate Risk and Sustainable Finance at the CSER at the University of Cambridge, and Mark Leonard, the Director of the European Council on Foreign Relations, based, I think, in Berlin. Great to have you all. And David is going to stay around and comment on some of these things and also on some of your questions, which I can see streaming in. Let me start with a panel. And I'd love all of your thoughts. I'm going to start with Mark, in fact. I'd like to pick up one of David's final points, and that's whether democracy itself has fared well in all this, in the coronavirus crisis. Because we've had this extraordinary spectacle in the crisis of governments faced with essentially the same threat, maybe to different degrees, and it really showing all kinds of things about their very system of government, not just as scraps as we've had here and arguments about how the Cabinet Office is organized, but it's really shone a light on the very nature of democracy. And as David said, it has posed the question of whether authoritarian countries have done better. Mark, you've written widely about these kind of things and indeed about China. And I was wondering what your take was, first of all, on that question.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. I think what this has done is almost x-rayed our democratic system. And the question which I think lies behind both our response to COVID, but even more the response to climate change, is whether when something this huge hits the planet, we feel like we're all in it together and look for collective solutions, or whether we're in a mood to look for how we can do better in relative terms, how we can sort ourselves out and help ourselves. And in the Cold War, there was an American TV series that where they had scientists who were so terrified that the Soviet Union and the United States would end up in a nuclear holocaust. So they invented an alien invasion to get both sides to focus on planetary survival rather than who was up and who was down in the Cold War. And in a way, COVID and climate change mean that today's TV presenters don't need to invent a kind of space invasion. But at the same time, I do think that it's quite hard to see how you get out of a logic of relative gains, both within our countries for some of the reasons that David talked about, but also at a global on a global level. And in many ways, climate change, what we were told 20 years ago when it started becoming really important, was that it would reshape our politics. It would move from national to global. We'd move from thinking about power to international law. Science rather than emotion would determine what we've done. But over the last 15, 20 years, we seem to have gone in the opposite direction. And I don't understand why, except by looking maybe at some of the ways that our politics has been changed by technology. And I think maybe underlying it all is the way that the digital revolution has changed our public sphere and the capacity of democracies to deal with these things. And I think it's done it by actually tipping the balance more in favor of relative gains in different ways. I think three main ways. One, by creating a much more segregated society. So we live in filter bubbles, we consume different news. The idea of a public sphere, of being able to actually unite behind a long-term project, is much more difficult. Secondly, we live in this sort of era of hyper comparison, and you talked about it for national governments. All democracies were having to compare themselves in terms of death figures and other figures on a daily basis with everyone else in the world. But also because of social media, we don't compare ourselves to our neighbors or our parents, but to the most successful people in the world. So therefore people are constantly unhappy, and there is this epidemic of envy which has been unleashed. But I think thirdly, and most importantly, which lies behind all these things, is a total loss of control. If we are all connected to each other, there's a real limit to what any individual country can do on climate change, on the pandemic, and that therefore leads to a cynicism about these global solutions. And I do think that if you have democracies which are structured around this digital system, the sorts of wartime sacrifices that David was talking about are much harder, exponentially harder to pull off, and it's much easier to have that kind of longer term perspective for a political system like China. So I think
So that's the nugget I was trying to get from you. You've given us a fistful of terribly interesting ideas, many of which I'll come on to. But I just want us to start on that challenge that David has thrown down of, has China really done this better? Marina, can I come to you next?
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian. So I think I'd like to start by coming back to Douglas's reference to Greta in her comparison of COVID crisis to climate change crisis, and that politicians have to treat climate crisis as a real crisis. I think in order to understand kind of why democracies mobilized so quickly in response to COVID compared to climate, and what the challenges are for democracies compared to hypothetically what authoritarian regimes, I think it's helpful to think about the characteristics of these problems. So first, it's the important characteristics that distinguish climate change from current pandemic is because the problem of climate change is currently invisible. So the majority of population has not yet experienced severe consequences from climate change firsthand. And those who have might not be able to attribute their hardship to the elusive problem of changing climate. And although in the long term, the problem is acute and severe, it doesn't affect human survival right now. And second, there is a significant time lag between our actions and climate response. It takes a long time before the results from climate change interventions from governments like policies become visible in the environment around the public. And besides, the sources of climate change are so diffuse that it's difficult to assign responsibility or hold particular actors accountable. And in democratic politics, for politicians, there is always an incentive to deliver visible results quickly, to appeal to the electorate within their mandate, to get attention, to get re-elected, to deliver short term within their period in office, sort of to stay in power. And it seems to be incompatible with long-term problems like climate change. So the authoritarian system might seem attractive in this regard, because authoritarian regimes, first and foremost, can respond quickly, can mobilize more quickly. But the problem is that the decision-making in authoritarian regimes mostly depend on the leader and the elite surrounding the leader. So there is no guarantee that it will be in the leader's interest to actually invest in climate change. And in democracies, there are always constraints. There are checks and balances from the judicial system, from bureaucracy. There are accountability channels from below, media, civil society, which we don't have in authoritarian regimes. So while authoritarian model can seem attractive, we actually have not really seen empirically, if we compare all democratic regimes and compare authoritarian regimes on average, how they performed in their responses to climate. We have not seen that authoritarian regimes have done better than democracies, or even on par than democracies. Democratic states actually outperform authoritarian regimes on average. Are
you talking economically, or are you talking about crisis?
About climate crisis in particular.
About climate crisis.
Yes.
Okay, so that sets up the issues very, very neatly. Thank you very much indeed for that. Let me bring in Edward now. Edward, I think you're speaking to us from the land of Trump and Biden. Is that right?
I am indeed.
In which case, thank you for giving up your Thanksgiving, or part of it. There's some stock taking of this peculiar test that coronavirus has made of democracy. How does it stack up in your view compared to how China's done?
So I think it depends on which democracies you're looking at. The United States, Britain, Brazil, populist-led countries have not done particularly well, as I think you might have expected. Countries where there is high public trust in government, which is very clearly not Britain, United States, or Brazil. Countries like where Marina is, Norway, Germany, Taiwan, South Korea, New Zealand have done very, very well. I think Francis Fukuyama summarized it best which countries have performed the most impressively during COVID, and those are ones that have demonstrated competence. And the ones that have demonstrated competence, regardless of whether they're liberal democracies, illiberal democracies, soft authoritarian, are ones where there is quite a large degree of public trust in government. Now, clearly, where I'm sitting, the United States, it's pretty much as low as you get, not just by global standards, but also by America's standards. Public trust in government has been plummeting for many years, even since before 2008. This graph has been going down, down, down. I would agree with David's diagnosis of Trump's defeat earlier this month. I think if COVID hadn't happened, it would have been at best a 50-50 chance for Biden. I don't think Trump was destined to win prior to the pandemic, but I think he had odds-even chance of winning. And then from May onwards, it went to 70-30, 80-20 against. The mishandling of the pandemic, the impact on the over 65s in America and their vote, which was, I think, a decisive shift in this election, leads me to agree with David's conclusion that without COVID, Trump might have been re-elected. Biden now comes in, as people have been remarking, with two priorities. The first is to conquer the pandemic. And we shouldn't sort of prematurely celebrate that. He's got a country that is bitterly divided on social distancing rules, on masks, and a lot of vaccine hesitancy and anti-vaxxer sentiment. So he's got to sort of win public trust, precisely the thing that's lacking in the American political system. And I think really the sort of root cause of America's democratic problems. He's got to win public trust. And then he has, after having flattened the pandemic, the broader agenda, of which climate change is absolutely central. And if he cannot win back the Senate in the two Georgia runoffs in early January, and it remains therefore under Republican control, Mitch McConnell's leadership, it's going to be extremely hard to do anything meaningful on climate change. He can take executive actions. He can rejoin the Paris Club. It's a very good sign that he's appointed John Kerry as the climate envoy, but without the ability to back up America's pledges through legislation, through putting a price on carbon and other measures, it's going to be a very, very limited agenda. I'll stop there because it's a huge subject, and I'm sure we're going to.
Yeah, we'll tease out other bits of it, but thanks very much indeed. And Ellen, let me come to you again. This a huge subject, but in a way a very clear and direct question of what this crisis has shown us about democracy versus more authoritarian models.
Well, I mean, I'm actually really glad that David has questioned some of these usually unquestionable ideas, because I think that is the sort of thing that we can helpfully bring out of this crisis. Quite controversially, I'm not that worried about China when it comes to climate change, precisely because they have a great ability to simply make things happen in a very short period of time by mobilizing masses of capital and people and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean that I think that democracy can't do the same job. I think it's just a lot more difficult, and perhaps that effort can create something wonderful and effective too. But so there have been some comments about trust. So it is societal trust, but it's also trust in the very idea of government. You're unlikely to get trust in a government that doesn't believe in its own role as an effective deliverer of services for people. And I think that's one of the patterns that I've seen in the countries that have performed poorly versus those that have performed well. So if you're democracy, you obviously need that, but you also need a bunch of other supportive functions. It's a lot about norm shaping, as much as the rules. So you need to have, I think social movements do play an enormous role in all of this, which is why I also am, I think Extinction Rebellion has actually changed legislation, including in the UK. I think that was a tipping point. But I also think, I look a lot at institutional investors like pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, and they can play a supportive function by addressing systemic risk, basically holding companies to accountable when they can cross borders, which governments can't. So that can help reinforce democracies as well. But it's just a lot more difficult task.
All right, well, let's pick up some of these questions on public trust, which you've all referred to in different ways, and just explore them a bit. And David spent quite a bit of his talk talking about them and the strain, and particularly on the generational bargain. And I'd love your views on whether you think public trust has compliance, as David was describing it, has really kind of changed during this crisis in a way that might help governments deal with climate change. I'm going to come to the bulk of questions later, and please keep them coming. There's some great ones coming in. Let me just weave in one now, though, that's relevant to this, from Al Monacan Dam, saying, don't you think that the radical behavioural changes that David's been discussing have only happened because we've known that it would be temporary, really very unlike climate-related behavioural change that would have to be more permanent? So, I mean, have we seen anything that gives us hope or pessimism about how people are behaving? I mean, who'd like to take that first? Mark.
So we did a lot of polling in about 10 different countries, looking at to what extent attitudes towards government and trust had been changed and science as a result of the crisis. And what we found, actually, to summarize it very crudely, is that in places where people trusted the government, they ended up trusting it even more. And in places where people didn't trust the government, they trusted it even less. So it was not so much at the level of population. But if you look at France, for example, people who liked Macron before the crisis end up liking Macron and think he's a great leader. Those who hated Macron hate him much more. So it's been a kind of amplifier of pre-existing conditions in different places. In the Nordic countries, where you had very high levels of trust in the government, that has sort of been amplified by the crisis. And, in places like the UK and the US, where you have very polarized populations with different attitudes, that has been happened. I mean, I don't know about, as I think David was right to be very skeptical about how enduring these attitudes are. And I think what he said about the global financial crisis was very sobering. The fact that the global financial crisis gave us Obama, and in many ways Obama then gave us Trump. So who knows what the longer term solution, what long COVID looks like for politics. But certainly in the short term, it hasn't yet had a kind of dramatic impact in most of the countries where we did polling, which are right across Europe, in terms of people's attitudes and their trust in government.
Ed, have you got any thoughts on this from the American perspective? Public trust has not been something people have talked about in a positive way that much this year.
So a couple of thoughts. I mean, the first is that the nature by which Trump is leaving office, the seeds he's sowing of challenging Biden's legitimacy, the stolen election narrative, and this sort of highly fissile and completely unprecedented transition is, I think, going to probably push the trust problem even lower, even the trust levels even lower than they were before Trump came to office. So that's the sort of the bad thing. The good thing, and we will see that the proof of the pudding eating after January the 20th, if it is a Republican Senate, the one person in democratic politics who can test the theory that Obama ran on in the abstract, namely that there's no red state America or blue state America, there's the United States of America. It is a bipartisan culture. The one person who can test that proposition in practice is Joe Biden. That's his whole persona. So if Biden can't make it work, if he can't make deals with Republicans, it's because what Trump has sowed, this deepening of the distrust, is actually taking hold amongst half the population. But the positive thing I was going to say is, we do now have 3 vaccines coming out of the West, 2 of them from America, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. As David said in his lecture, we were schooled to think it takes 5 to 8 years to produce vaccines. Well, this has been 8 months. And it's still early days, of course. We've got to see how effective they are in practice as opposed to the clinical trials. But the fact that we've been able to produce them with this speed and assuming we're going to be able to distribute them, and if the Oxford one comes good, at cost, and it's a pretty low cost to the developing world, then we could have quite a massive positive demonstration effect of what can be done beyond just the sort of imminent emergency that David talked about in his lecture. This is a longer term thing. And so, but those are contradictory thoughts, if you like, but they're both very real.
Thanks for that. And Marina, I want to bring you in. And again, as I said, I'm going to save most of the questions for later, but let me just stir in another one that's directly relevant. And it's from Larissa Dome, who's watching from Gothenburg in Sweden as well, and saying a very interesting explanation about why democracies are struggling to address climate change. If increasing trust and changing social norms are key to democracies addressing climate change, then what could we do to make these two things happen?
There has been extensive research showing that changing countries' institutional setups, like corruption, for example, the level of corruption and overall institutional quality, how governments, agencies functions for the benefit of the citizens, whether they manage to deliver services to the public. All these issues have shown to affect interpersonal trust and trust in government. So shifting kind of attention towards issues on what citizens actually get to from politics, do politicians deliver, have a potential to increase citizens' trust into the government apparatus and satisfaction with the government. So I think this is one of the potential ways to go to deliver.
No, thanks very much indeed for that. And Ellen, from your perspective.
I think a lot about norms when it comes to climate change, and I suppose it's too soon to say whether this will actually emerge from COVID, but there are a couple of cognitive habits that I'm hoping that we can kind of iron into our way of thinking and being that has been kind of helpfully illustrated. So one is just the nature of systemic threats, things that no single person or country can address on its own. So it just makes it that much more obvious that cooperation is needed for large systemic issues like this. And then the other idea that half measures may not do the trick. So if you kind of largely reduce the instance of the virus in your country, it will come back. But the countries that have actually eliminated it, just taken all of the resources necessary to actually deal with the problem, are finding that it's kind of easier to maintain that state. So those are two kind of thoughts that I'm hoping take hold. But equally, this whole monetary policy or fiscal policy question, which I hope we'll get into a little more. When my PhD was on the education of economists, and even the kind of fringe left-wing economists I interviewed for that project did not want to associate themselves with MMT. or modern monetary theory at the time. This was just a few years ago. And now the standards that you would use to measure that would make us all MMT adherents. Now every country in the world is beyond the limits that we thought were possible. So there are norms that are have changed in a few months, and hopefully some of that we can think through in terms of its application to climate change as well.
So you've taken us exactly to the point that I wanted, and let's pick that up right now, the money question, if you like. And as David put it, maybe there is a magic money tree now, but then his second point, coronavirus has eaten it all up, or picked the fruit, or whatever you want to say. It spent that lot of money, and there is no doubt that climate change is going to take a lot of money and a lot of adjustments. So, I mean, I would love people's views on this, and there are lots and lots of questions on this point. Really, how do you pay for it? Ellen, do you want to continue, as you very happily brought us to this point?
I'd be delighted to. No, I think there's going to be a lot more spending. I believe, because we're just in maintenance mode now. There's going to have to be a lot of rebuilding. I think there's more money in the money tree, so we have to think about what mistakes we made in this first round to ensure that we better spend it. I also think we don't know yet what the actual limit for a country that that investors trust will pay back the money. I don't think we know what the limit of debt is yet. We might find out, but I don't think we know what it is yet. The problem is that we're going to build a disproportionate amount of future infrastructure in the next couple of years, for example. So we have to make sure that we're doing that really carefully. And this is where I think we all need to make a big fuss and make it that much easier, facilitate the actions of governments to think much more long term, because it is kind of true that we're not going to get another opportunity quite like this for a while, especially outside of wartime.
Ed, what do you think? David, I'm going to come back to you at the end when we've had the panel discussion and throw some of these at you, but that's absolutely one of them. Ed?
Well, so we're heading back into what increasingly looks like to be a double-dip recession because of this second coronavirus wave in the United States, and Europe's tipping back too. So there's no doubt about it that more fiscal support is required. The monetary support is hard to improve on zero interest rates and effective quantitative easing across the economy. Fiscal support is required, and on both sides of the Atlantic, it's looking problematic. In Europe, of course, Poland and Hungary are putting a block on the recovery fund. Here, to go back yet again to Mitch McConnell, if there's a Republican Senate, the $2-3 trillion relief package that Biden wants to pass looks unlikely to pass. It'll have to be slimmed down. It'll have to have a lot of liability waivers for businesses that choose to keep open against the liability of them catching coronavirus, their employees catching coronavirus. It's not going to be a big stimulus. It needs to be a big stimulus. So, I mean, I guess the larger point I'd make on climate change is you don't have to have a magic money tree to address climate change. There is what's called the carbon dividend plan, which is a conservative plan championed by George Shultz, James Baker, former secretaries of state, real pillars of the Republican establishment, which imposes a carbon tax of, say, $40 a ton. And then those earning below the median income get a carbon dividend. They get a rebate in the mail. It's revenue neutral. There's no funds raised from this, but there's a massive market signal and incentive system there for the private sector to spend the funds to completely decarbonize the American economy. That doesn't require a magic money tree. It's a market-based plan that would work. So, again, to go back to, I'd hate to be a stuck record, you need the elected Republicans to agree with this for this to happen.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to stir in as well a comment from Ross McBride saying modern monetary policy, otherwise known as the unlimited printing of money, has historically always ended badly with economic and political decline. And does the panel and David think that this basic law of economic gravity has been suspended permanently? Mark?
Oops. I'm not an economist, and economists have done such a great job of predicting events in the last few years. I'm not sure that I really know the answer to that question. But what I think is quite clear is that as we go into this, the questions of distribution are going to become more and more central to our politics. And as societies become more and more polarized between different groups, and you have this politics of envy taking place in different areas, I think the sorts of policies that Ellen and Ed were talking about become much more difficult, because they are going to be very obviously exploited and weaponized by different groups, both within all of our democracies, but also between them. And we're seeing within the EU, there was an amazing coming together around this recovery plan, which people thought was completely impossible. Dogma and taboos were overturned. And now there is a sort of backlash coming in from Poland, from Hungary, from all sorts of other places. And climate does seem to be, the next wave of the culture war. It's going to be the front line in lots of different places, as David was talking about. And when it's linked up with huge amounts of money going from some parts of society to others, it's quite difficult to be optimistic about those transfers being taking place in a seamless way, rather than them becoming toxic, given the nature of politics in so many of our different democracies.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed for that. And Marina, I mean, would you accept? Would you tilt towards Ed's view that climate change isn't necessarily going to need its own enormous sums of money, or the more pessimistic ones of some of our questioners?
I think I'm more on the Ed side here, because after all, climate change is a collective action issue, not only on the global level, but also on the national level. All the actors that involved in polluting the environment. It's not only governments that need to invest, but also we need to see the change from the business sectors, from people, and. It is possible for the businesses to make the production greener. We already have seen behavioral change during COVID pandemic, as David mentioned. So, but why we need the governments is to steer this collective action towards the climate-friendly way, but it does not necessarily have to involve huge investments, because it's for everyone to pitch in a little bit. And it's more requires an economic shift rather than huge political investments like required during during the COVID pandemic.
Okay, so thank you for that. And you've again brought us to the final point I want to ask you as a panel, which is a point that it seems to me if David had wanted to add to the pessimistic side of his ledger, he could have added. And that he used the phrase a lot, concerted action on climate change. And countries, as we know, will have to act together in order to get any benefit themselves. And yet that seems to be quite different from coronavirus, where in fact there was a marked lack of international action, even within the EU. Countries were really looking first at self-interest and trying to act for their own populations. And I wondered what you thought might strengthen the ability of countries to act in a concerted way, and whether there's anything we might take from the coronavirus episode on that. Mark, this is your territory, Mark.
I mean, I have to say that on the one hand, the climate is obviously the one thing that really links everyone together. What could be more connected than the air we breathe, etc. You have seen amazing political mobilization through the EU. The promise of a Green New Deal in America is very exciting as well. I think what people were saying, what Ed and others were saying about abilities of buying off large interest groups in our economies and our societies, and making sure that they benefit from it. Those are all reasons to be optimistic. But at the same time, I do worry that as we go further into these processes, that there will be a backlash that emerges. That's what happened with the global financial crisis, which was on a much smaller scale than what happened now. There was a massive corporate bailout, which had almost no democratic scrutiny in different places, was done in the heat of the crisis. And then, a bit like the second wave of the virus, there was a second sort of political wave where you had populists elected in all sorts of different places. And I that's my bigger fear, that the climate emergency, rather than bringing people together, will become more of a culture war, will lead to a massive counter mobilization by different groups against what's been done in the sort of short to medium term. And I think that digital technologies, which is where I started, make that more likely than it would have done. It does put a big kind of finger on the scales away from long-term collective action and the sorts of measures that I think we need to take if we want to survive.
Great. Brief thoughts from any of the rest of you, and then I'm coming to David. Ellen, absolutely.
I think if you want concerted action on climate change, and just to link this to some of the earlier comments, I think you need both, carbon pricing or carbon dividend. That has been tried actually in British Columbia, in Canada, for over a decade. It's been uncontroversial because it was widely accepted. In fact, the support went for it up after it was implemented. But actually, that can't get to transformational change on the order of building charging stations for all of the vehicles we need to transition, and so on and so forth. You need both, and both the magic money tree and carbon dividend and a whole bunch of other things, and as quickly as possible, and with the supportive kind of governance element of large pension funds and other institutional investors that actually own, in many cases, the majority of some of these big companies that can usually flit across borders and undermine democratic processes, including through lobbying. So I think you just need all of it, and fast, and that's a matter of democratic will as well, actually.
Great, thank you. Marina, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment briefly on the concerted action. It seems like what we have on the international level does not look that bad. We have countries claiming universally that they will comply with Paris Agreement. They're putting up ambitious NDC, nationally determined commitments that they were going to follow. So people or countries would like to show a good image of themselves as climate actors on the international arena. But I think the problem is the national level actors, or what's happening within the states, and the businesses that trying to exert their lobby despite the international commitments. It's more, I think it's, we have in the Center of Collective Action Research, we say that in order to make people act for the collective good, to make people act for climate, climate needs to be in the personal interests of everyone. So if we could shift, and I think this making climate in the interests of everyone will be different depending on the context, depending on the country, depending on the person. So the solution, I don't think that it is universal. It will be, I think developing countries, the growing economies might need a little bit different approach into how to incorporate climate into their programs compared to more wealthier countries.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And Ed, very briefly, though it's not a brief subject, and this is not a very united time of the world acting together. What do you think? Where do you think we're going to get on this?
I mean, I think we have learned some lessons in the last few years. The one that sticks out to me most is the Yellow Vest movement in France, which was in a reaction to a petrol price, a tax increase. And then resulted in Macron sort of giving them lots of subsidies and fiscal sops. This is the absolute beauty of the carbon dividend, is it out-populists the populists. You're using the methods of populism. It's kind of a gimmick, but you are getting $2,000-3,000 check in the post, and it's a carbon dividend. This is from what's been raised from more than covering the extra money you're paying on filling up your car or your utility bills. it outpopulists the populists. And you know, the Yellow Vest movement wouldn't have happened if that kind of thinking had been happening in France at the time. So I think we are learning how to do this. Just the other point I wanted to emphasize is John Kerry being appointed as Biden's climate envoy. And of course, Britain is hosting the next, America will rejoin the Paris Agreement on the day one of Biden's administration. But then later next year in Glasgow, Britain will host the next international meeting on climate change. There is a lot that can be taken from how the vaccine is distributed as a demonstration effect for what can be done on climate. If that is done well, if America rejoins COVAX, if it does get distributed relatively efficiently and the worst of vaccine nationalism can be headed off, then there could be all kinds of demonstration effects, as I say, from the vaccine that can be fed into the debate about how to tackle global warming.
Well, thanks very much on that. David, I want to come back to you now before I bring in some other questions, and there's some really very good ones coming in. But you've heard the panel discussion, and there's some particular challenges in there, it seems to me, for you and from our questioners outside. One on the money. Where are you on how much countries should look at borrowing now? And then perhaps again on this point about whether countries are capable of acting together in the way that arguably they're going to need to do for climate change.
I will respond to those. I want to say a couple of, in the spirit of my lecture, a couple of optimistic things I took from what was said, and then a couple of pessimistic things, just picking up on a few things that people said. I mean, the Ed's line about trust and competence, there's a kind of chicken and egg problem in that you need trust for competence, you need competence for trust, in the sense that the governments that seemed competent were competent because people trusted them. But it can also, there can be, and Ed's talked about this, there can be various virtuous circles that come out of this. Maybe you only need a small amount of competence to start to generate some trust. And once you get that going, I think it's at least possible that these things can feed off each other. And that there are different ways this could go next year and beyond, even in the countries that haven't done well, even in the United States. It could turn around, and I also think it is possible. One of the questions, I think, was this behavioural change, won't it just be temporary because we know it's temporary? Well, I think there is a lot of evidence that behavioural change that people think is temporary lasts. You don't know, and actually particularly in wartime, things that people think were just for the duration of the conflict. And then it turns out that actually societies and individuals adjust to that. And I think we don't know yet which of these that we're going to get. And I think some of the behavioral change will stick. On the money and the possibility that there are ways of doing this without the magic money tree, I think there are, but precisely because that requires in the United States legislation, it's really hard. So I've also just been, I literally today finished Obama's book. The section on how he got Obamacare through would put anyone off trying to pass complicated legislation of that kind. And he just got it through with, well, he started with 60 seats in the Senate, then he lost Kennedy's seat. But he had definitely a stronger headwind post the 2008 election than Biden has, and it was a complete nightmare. It was a very significant piece of legislation, and it is possible. But it is, it goes to my point, it's incredibly hard to squeeze these things through the kind of narrow prism of contemporary representative democratic politics. And it's the thing I just feel doesn't get said enough, which is, what if we did democracy a bit differently? When are we going to think that maybe these things don't fit? If it's that hard to do legislation this way, are there not other ways we could try to legislate that don't involve these kinds of roadblocks? And that kind of institutional change is incredibly hard. But there is a lot of innovation and experimentation happening at subnational levels in democratic politics. None of it has reached the national level yet. But at some point it might. And unless it does become increasingly difficult to see how this kind of politics, and I think we are too attached to the idea that this way that we've done democracy for the last 50 years is the only way to do it. It's historically brief and contingent, and it worked really well in about 1994. or whenever but it's in the broader sweep, not just of history, but the history of democracy. The bit where this way of doing democracy worked well is relatively brief. But
David, just a fraction more, if you would, on what you mean by this way of doing democracy, because I imagine if there were members of the Senate or Parliament listening to this, they would leap up at this point and say, "Look, you're talking about us. We're not a roadblock. We are democracy, and we're here to challenge."
They are one way of doing democracy, but I mean, fixated on elections, party-based. So this is a party-based system. Very heavily representative rather than participatory. And I know the Brexit referendum has put a lot of people off direct democracy, but there are lots of ways of doing it that aren't referendums, where the people are asked periodically to pass judgment over how their politicians have done over the last 4 years. And the other ways of doing it include not just direct participatory politics that includes, I think, process politics, but also forms of deliberation, other forms of participation, changes to the electoral system, changes to the franchise. I mean, I'll say this because I say it and people always stop listening as soon as I say it. But I always think a good test of this is, I think there are lots of good arguments for enfranchising children, that children should vote. Now, I don't think it's ever going to happen, but it shocks people to their core. I've done it enough with real audiences where you can look into their eyes, and people either laugh, belly laugh, or they shout, or they once threw things at me because it was thought to be so shocking. So if that's shocking, and yet, watching the planet burn is not shocking, we've somehow got our priorities a bit the wrong way around. I mean, if children were to vote, the world wouldn't end. Actually, I don't think that much would change. I just think it might inject some energy and vitality into our politics. And it would at least show that we're capable of change. But we are incredibly, all of us, small c conservative about democracy, partly because we think if we don't cling on to this thing, we'll get fascism or authoritarianism. I don't think we will. I think there are lots of things that we could do. And the very last thing I wanted to say, because I just love Mark's line, I wish I'd thought of it, political long COVID is such a great analogy for this, because there is the short and the long. And the short politics of this, the immediate Biden, Trump, next 100 days dealing with the pandemic. But from what I know about long COVID, its features are that it is surprising. The symptoms are surprising. And also, just when you think you're over it, it comes back. And I suspect actually, as an analogy for the long-term political consequences of 2020, that's quite a good one.
Okay, well, thanks for that. That could make a whole other lecture, and I suspect we're going to get more questions on the children line. Let me bring in some other questions now, and indeed, one that picks up just on that point from Timothy Gardnash, who says, "Fascinating talk, David. Is green liberalism contradiction in terms, or possible in principle, but unreformed structure of democratic politics makes it very unlikely to be done?" David, do you want to give a response, and then I'll come to the rest of the panel if they want to chip in. They may not. Go ahead.
I mean, I think that does. I mean, it's a great question. Obviously, it depends a lot what we mean by green liberalism, and we haven't talked about green parties. There are some very serious green parties, particularly in Germany, and green politics comes and goes, and we haven't heard much about it as an electoral force this year during the pandemic. But again, I wouldn't be at all surprised if we think that the medium-term consequences of long political COVID are unpredictable, that the fortunes of explicitly environmental political parties may surprise us in some ways. But I do think it is incredibly difficult with an unreformed democratic politics, particularly, of course, of the kind in the United States and the UK, which is essentially first past the post. I mean, the other thing that we have to remember, I don't just, when I say party politics, in the case of Britain and the United States, the two main parties have been the two main parties, though they've changed their character for a century or more. And it's two-party systems are the hardest things of all to reform. And that challenge, I think, is enormous. It's not as if proportional representation is a magic political solution to this, but some of, I think, to go back to the who's done badly, I think it is not a coincidence that the first past the post and presidential system, so leaving aside right populism and who wins, the first past the post and presidential systems have done worse. I mean, some people say that if you want to trace the roots of New Zealand's success this year, You need to go back to the referendum they had on changing the voting system nearly 2 decades ago. And I think there is something in that. Institutional change and structural change is boring and unsexy, and it takes time, and it's sometimes the most important thing.
Any of the rest of you? And I'm looking particularly at Ed, but he's not going to know that.
Let me make a point about the difficulty of structural change, of changing the rules of the game in the United States. You know, New Zealand.
And can I say, I believe we have someone from the House of Representatives watching. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, okay. A Dem or a Republican? It might sway how I phrase this.
No, you're not. I'm not going to tell you.
Right. Which
it's a veil of ignorance.
It's a veil of ignorance. Thank you, Mark. I will take heed of that. To change the Constitution, to get a constitutional amendment through, requires not just 2/3 of each chamber, but 3/4 of the states. And sort of the key problem at the moment in American politics, which gets worse with each cycle, is malapportionment, meaning that the smaller, thinly populated states get more and more disproportionate representation with each election. So to change that system, you'd have to ask South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, these tiny states with 300,000-400,000 people, each of which have 2 senators and therefore a disproportionate share in the electoral college to elect the president. You'd have to, it's Thanksgiving here, it would be like asking turkeys to vote for Thanksgiving. They're not going to vote for it. It is not going to happen. And so my concern with the American constitutional situation is it's incapable of bending. There is no conceivable way I can imagine, even if you had a constitutional amendment saying apple pie tastes nice, I doubt that would get passed. There's no conceivable way this system is going to be reformed. And we now have a Supreme Court that's going to ensure, it's 6-3, the most originalist, strict textualist adherence to the words of late 18th century men. So my concern about America is because it just can't bend. The danger that it will break should not be underestimated. And how that would break, I don't know. But this system is not reformable, and that's the real problem. Other countries are much more reformable.
Anyone else from another country want to come in on this? Ellen, go ahead.
I've been just observing how federalism seems to exacerbate a lot of this. I'm from Canada, which is kind of isolates some of the variables that you might look at with the US and the UK, because it's got a left-leaning government and trust in government and so on and so forth. But the municipal level of government is begging the provincial levels of government to do something, and then the provincial levels of government are kind of asking this federal government to do something, and the federal government does not feel empowered to do that. And you see that kind of dynamic in both the UK and the US as well. So even if you have some of those other ingredients in place, it's a real challenge structurally. And that'll also map onto climate change, I fear.
And Ellen, let me just ask you, because one of the factors which Ed was describing about the US is, as we know, the federal system, the very, very strong states' rights. I mean, from a Canadian perspective, a federal country, has that been a strength or a weakness in dealing with this? And we have obviously different setup in the UK, but a lot of argument and more next year about what powers the devolved parts of the country should have.
I actually think it has been harmful. In other ways, I mean, Canadian federalism, sometimes I can argue that the provinces actually have more powers than the states do in the US, and different types of powers. But this is exactly the case in which you want to have a federal government that's empowered to make decisions for the good of the mass, as opposed to having porous borders controlled by, well, no borders, but with different administrations with different interests, rules, and communication styles. I just don't think that that's been helpful for this. And it also, because transport, energy, air, water also cross provincial or state borders, it's a similar issue with climate change.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And let me just weave in a comment on one of Marina's remarks from Robin G, saying that Marina's comment that democratic politics has a problem with longer term issues is reinforced for me by the problem we have had in the UK, especially England, of low house building over decades. We go to another one from Elliot Whittington, who says, great talk. lots of them say great talk. If we need innovation in democracy to address climate change and also challenges like COVID, where does that innovation most acutely need to occur? And I thought from the first part of this question that was about technological innovation, but then he says, after all, there are ideas like the Citizens' Assembly, which seem good, but I'm not sure if they actually address the failures that David is outlining. Marina, is that something you'd like to muse on, these innovations in democracy that might help?
It seems like a good idea, but it's again goes down to how acceptant the politicians are of these innovations. It's after all, it's the decision-making structures have to be legitimate, and the innovations sometimes are not do not have this strong connection to the traditional electoral process, so they are questionable. And in the end, it always comes down to what the politicians would listen to. But I think that these types of innovations, like deliberations in the various forums, are only for the better if they are listened to. They bring out various voices, but in the end, again, as David has mentioned, with the younger generation being more active in them, and these could be like one of the few forums for the younger generation to actually voice their opinions to the older leaders. This seems to be promising. But we don't have any empirical evidence, unfortunately, or large-scale empirical evidence to build any hopes for the future yet.
A political scientist,
but it certainly has to be tested.
Thank you for that. Let me bring in a question from Robert Pito, saying, do you think that proportional representation would better reflect our society and help to deal with the disaffection of the young? David, can I come back to you, because we were tantalizingly going down that kind of direction?
I mean, on the whole, I think yes, but I don't think it's not as if we don't have evidence to draw on there. And I think the grass always seems a bit greener. People in first past the post systems look at proportional systems and think that they are fairer in how they represent people in proportional systems, sometimes quite like the decisiveness of first past the post systems. It's true, and there was an attempt at electoral reform in the UK. We think we've had all these referendums. We forget what might have been the most consequential one, the AV referendum in 2011, which was decisively rejected. It's not just that politicians are resistant to change. The electorate is also very resistant to change. It's quite easy to paint changes to the rules of the game as necessarily going to leave everyone a little bit worse off. But there is also this aspect of it, I mean, to connect it to citizens' assemblies too, that we tend to come up with these things when we think we're stuck. So there was a point in the nightmarish phase of Brexit where a number of MPs tried to canvass for a citizens' assembly to sort of break the deadlock. And that really is not going to work. Just when politics has completely broken down, the idea that a citizens' assembly will restore people's trust, you can't bring it in at the end when everything, because at that point, everyone is so angry with everyone. No one's going to listen to a group of citizens. You have to, I think, with democratic politics, be willing to conduct conscious experiments. I mean, one of the things that always strikes me so odd is we live in a society where there is so much experimentation going on all the time, a lot of it unwitting for many of the people who are taking part in it. Facebook is experimenting 100 times a day on its network of users, and yet we are incredibly reluctant to try things out in democratic politics to see if they might work. And it may be we don't have the time, and it may be we don't have the bandwidth, but we don't even try. And I think the world will not end if we try a few citizens' assemblies and see how they go. But we're incredibly reluctant. And for all Ed's points that in the United States, that any kind of change to particularly the Constitution, but to the basic rules looks almost impossible. But given what he said, that's very bleak. The thought it can't bend, so at some point it might break. But those of us who have slightly more room for, including in the UK, where after all, our constitution, because it's not codified, doesn't limit what we can do. You can have a referendum tomorrow and you can make up the rules in Parliament just by legislating for it. We are incredibly reluctant to experiment. And one thing this pandemic has done is it has divided the UK, and we are now seeing very different kinds of politics in the different nations of the UK. And that, at least to be optimistic, suggests to me that we are running a kind of natural experiment. We may start to, it may end up with Scottish independence, but we're so resistant to it. I don't know what we're so afraid of. I mean, given that we're running such huge risks with the actual decisions we take, why are we so afraid of changing some of the ways that we do it?
I'm going to squeeze in one last question, and I'm going to go, there's lots of terrific questions and lots of detailed ones about Hungary and more on the economy and so on. I'm sorry I can't get them all in. And I'm going to go to Ed Luce first, and then allow him to make a graceful exit, because he has Thanksgiving demands, which anyone who's got any contact with the US will know are really quite serious. We're very grateful for his time. And then that will give you time, the rest of you, including David, to muse on the question, which is from Richard Otten, and it takes us right back to the beginning, and it says, so is benign dictatorship the answer? Ed, this is your price of your Thanksgiving lunch.
That's going to put me off my lunch, I think, if I think of it that way. I think there are many ways to skin the cat. We've got a very interesting moment in the United States, in that we've got an incoming administration that is going to pick up the cudgels again, if that's the right word, of democracy promotion, of values-based foreign policy, as they call it. Obama didn't do that. Basically, Bush, with the Iraq War, put off everybody from doing that. First of all, the left, and then, of course, Trump's Republican Party, for very different reasons in Trump's case. We're going to now have an unapologetically pro-democracy American administration. And, one thing we haven't had time to get into today in any substantive way, but which is at the center of everything we're talking about, is the future of US-China relations. Nothing that we're discussing, is going to be solvable if the US and China continue heading into a Cold War situation. I'm not directly answering the question because, as a journalist, you want your proprietor to be a benign dictator. You just want a nice billionaire to own your paper and never to bother you. And so I can see the advantages of benign dictatorship. But I don't think you can legislate for it. And I think if you get it wrong and you get a malign dictatorship, then there's no way you can change your mind. So I'd rather not entertain that as except in the world of newspaper ownership, as a likely prospect.
Thank you. And thanks very, very much indeed for your time. Let's stick with the rest of the panel. Ellen.
Could I be cheeky and go back to the housing question, actually,
Yes.
that kind of flitted across our screens, because I think it actually pulls together many of the themes that David brought up in his talk. So one of the things that's happened with the COVID crisis is that we've had to watch what space is used for, what housing is used for as a kind of economic geography question. So suddenly we can house homeless people because people with who travel a lot don't have kind of hotel rooms that are waiting for them to arrive at them for a temporary period, and so on and so forth. That's an intergenerational piece that I think is going to be ever more serious as people in my generation and younger feel the kind of the strain and the knowledge that their elders got to experience a way of living in their homes that's much more expansive. And we're seeing with COVID, there are people who have a lovely home situation that they're confined to, and those who are in multi-generational households or cramped housing conditions are much angrier about that. And that is starting to spill out into democratic politics. So, we've actually had to pay much more attention to some of these Quotidian questions, and they do spill out into democracy, and they have everything to do with public policy and the use of space and housing, and that's going to be relevant for climate change as well, because we also have to retrofit everything and build new infrastructure.
Thank you for that, and you very neatly found your own way around the side of this question. Mark, let me come to you on this.
I think the dictatorship is pretty difficult in the 21st century, benign or malign. And I think what we're talking about here are problems of interdependence and ones where almost nobody is able actually to control anything at all. So it might be the answer, but I don't think that's the question that we're being posed about climate change. I think the big challenge is really to have any kind of control in this world. That's why there's maybe a craving for benign dictatorship from different places. But I think it's incredibly difficult to deliver, and it's certainly not going to be a solution to these sorts of problems which cut across different borders, which cut across different groups in increasingly fragmented societies.
Thank you. Marina.
Yeah, I would like to go back to the basics. And we all know the famous quote that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I don't believe in a benign dictatorship. You can perhaps be a benign dictator, but for some years, but then you need to be reappointed. And that's why we have elections. And environmental authoritarianism is a very attractive idea in theory, but it simply does not work. Power needs to be constrained in order for the system to produce outcome beneficial for the majority of the population. And although we have problems with democracies, I think we should work on improving them instead of sliding to authoritarianism, especially now when authoritarianism is actually driven by populists. And the populist movement are associated with short-term appeals to the public instead of long-term.
Thank you very much. And David, and I'm afraid really briefly, I'm sure we would enjoy another lecture on this.
So I was going to say what Marina said. Actually, I think corruption remains a very serious issue, and democracies are definitely better at dealing with corruption than dictatorships. I think British democracy remains remarkably uncorrupt, relatively speaking. I mean, I don't want to suggest that, but we should appreciate when democracy does deliver. I think the question to ask is not just where do you want to be in the worst case scenario in terms of a social or economic situation. Sometimes maybe you do want to be in a dictatorship because of the possibility for decisive action. But where do you want to be when your politics is at its worst? And when your politics is at its worst, you want to be in a democracy.
That's a really good way. Thank you. I'm going to bottle that one and take it away. We're going to have to wrap up now. Thank you for the terrific questions, and I'm sorry for all the ones that I couldn't get in. And I'm now going to hand over to Colm Lauder, who's the chairman of the Whitehall Group.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn, and thank you to all of our panellists and to David as well for a superb and enlightening discussion and lecture. As chairman of the Whitehall Group, I just want to first of all welcome everyone who's joined us this evening on the call. It's been a great pleasure hosting these events over the last couple of years, and believe it or not, this is our 9th annual series, so it's been a real great success for the Whitehall Group. And in that note, I want to call out in a particular note of thanks to Douglas Blawston, obviously founder and former chairman of the Whitehall Group, who led the efforts to continue the lecture series despite the challenges COVID placed at us with us. To David, that was a really superb discussion. I think you've opened up so many areas of discussion and views which are going to continue on and would have continued on right into the evening. But thank you very, very much. And it was a great pleasure to have you with us this evening. To Bronwyn, so elegantly and so ably chaired, thank you very much. It was a superb discussion. I think the questions you saw and the quality of the questions, we could have continued for much, much longer. To Mark Leonard, Edward Luch, to Marina Povitkina and Eden Quigley, thank you very much again for giving us your time, your energy, your enthusiasm to debate the topic. Again, we can go on, and the questions are very much in that vein, and the quality of the questions has been fantastic. I don't want to keep you all because we have promised everyone will get you out the door, or the metaphorical door at this stage, by 8 p.m. So thank you all again for attending. I do hope to be able to welcome you all to a physical event at some stage in the new year, hopefully sooner rather than later. But on that note, it's a very good night, and thank you very much for your time this evening, this afternoon, depending where you are. And for those who's joining us from this side of the Atlantic as well, a very happy Thanksgiving. Thank you very much.
I really want to check. Okay. For a couple. Good. How are you?
I'm only shaking your hand if you give more funding to our RFS. So many people here have lost their homes.
We need some beds.
We need more help.
Everything is so dry here, and it's been drying out for, 2 years. So it's very volatile. And of course we have the eucalyptus, which is in the air. It's volatile too.